Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the horrifying secret of a Georgia plantation mistress and her unspeakable acts in 1847 that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled, and if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder. Don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The year is 1864. The air in Burke County, Georgia, hangs thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from the humidity of late summer, the sweet, cloying scent of decay from the untended fields, and the metallic tang of a war nearing its brutal conclusion. For the men of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, this was the air they had breathed for months. Their blue uniforms were faded to a dusty gray, their faces gone beneath layers of grime and sweat. The march through the heart of the Confederacy had been a journey through a land of ghosts and deep-seated hatreds, a landscape scarred by cannon fire and ideologies as unyielding as the summer heat. But nothing in their brutal experience, not the roar of battle at Antietam, nor the sight of fallen comrades, could have prepared them for what they were about to find at the end of a long, overgrown lane, 7 miles from the nearest semblance of a town. The lane itself was the first sign that something was wrong. It was not just untended, it felt actively forgotten, as if the land itself were trying to swallow the path whole. Kudzu vines, thick as a man's arm, coiled around ancient oaks, strangling them in a slow, green embrace. Before them stood Thornhill Estate. It was not a ruin, but something worse, a place perfectly preserved in its own decay. Its white columns, meant to evoke the glory of ancient Greece, were stained with streaks of black mildew, like tear tracks on a forgotten monument. Its fields, once a sea of white cotton, lay fallow and choked with the aggressive, suffocating green of the kudzu. The entire estate seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a judgment long overdue. The main house was eerily empty. A tomb of abandoned gentility. Dust motes, thick as insects, danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating peeling wallpaper and overturned furniture. A fine layer of dust covered everything, a grey shroud that spoke of years, not months, of neglect. Yet, it was a sound from below, a muffled, rhythmic scrape from beneath the floorboards. That drew a young corporal named Miller to a heavy iron door, bolted from the outside, set into the foundation. It was a door designed not to keep intruders out, but to keep something or someone in. With the splintering crack of wood as a rifle butt smashed the lock and the groan of rusted metal hinges protesting their first movement in years. The door was forced open. It released a wave of stale, cold air thick with the smell of damp earth, unwashed bodies, human waste, and something else, something acrid and sour, like lingering fear, as their eyes adjusted to the gloom. A scene of impossible horror materialized, huddled together in the darkness of the root cellar, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows. Were 23 children. Some were toddlers with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to absorb the sudden intrusion of light without reaction. Others stood on the cusp of adolescence, their limbs long and awkward, their faces holding a premature, weary gravity. All were dressed in clean but threadbare homespun cloth, a stark, uniform gray against the blackness of the cellar. Yet, It was not their number or their squalid prison that caused the veteran soldiers to recoil in a wave of collective disbelief. It was their faces in the flickering lamplight. The phenomenon was undeniable and deeply, profoundly unsettling. Every single child possessed the same striking, almost aristocratic features: high, pronounced cheekbones, a cascade of hair the color of burnished auburn shot through with streaks of pure gold, and eyes of a pale, haunting green. They were not just siblings, they were echoes, near perfect replicas of one another. A living, breathing collection of human porcelain dolls, each one a slight variation on a single, obsessive theme. A lieutenant, a man named Elias Thorne, who had seen the worst of Antietam, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He knelt, his voice cracking despite his effort to remain gentle. "Who are you? Who does this to children?" The eldest, a girl of perhaps 13, with an unnerving poise that belied her years, looked up. Her green eyes were devoid of fear, filled instead with a strange, solemn acceptance, as if she were the keeper of a sacred, terrible truth. Her voice, clear and steady, cut through the suffocating silence of the cellar. "Mistress says we are her legacy," she stated, as if reciting a catechism learned by rote, a lesson drilled into her since birth. "We cannot leave, because we are her blood." The statement was so monstrous, so fundamentally incomprehensible, that it chilled the soldiers more than any battlefield they had ever faced. It spoke of a sin that had no name, a perversion of nature that defied all reason. A single cryptic entry in the regimental archives, found within a letter marked "confidential" by Lieutenant Thorne himself, is the only official military record of this discovery. For over a century, it lay buried, a footnote to a war filled with atrocities. More perplexing still is the local history of Burke County itself. In the meticulously kept records of births, deaths, and property deeds, the name Thornhill is conspicuously absent. It is as if the 700-acre plantation, its formidable mistress, and of the 23 children who bore her blood, were meticulously scrubbed from the annals of time, a collective act of willful forgetting by a community desperate to bury its shame. How could such a place and such a secret simply vanish? To understand the darkness that bloomed at Thornhill, one must first understand the soil in which it was planted. By the late 1840s, the American South was a kingdom built on cotton, but it was a kingdom beginning to crumble from within. The reign of King Cotton had been absolute, creating staggering wealth for a select few and shaping the political destiny of a nation. But this king was a tyrant, demanding ever more from a land that was growing exhausted. Decades of intensive, single-crop farming had leached the nutrients from the red Georgia clay, yielding progressively smaller harvests. The very ground that had birthed a generation of aristocrats was now turning barren. Thornhill Estate was a microcosm of this slow, agonizing decay. It was a world unto itself, a vast and isolated expanse of land where the nearest neighbor was a distant rumor and the word of its master was absolute law. The very air seemed heavy with a sense of stagnation and quiet desperation. The silence broken only by the buzz of insects and the rhythmic, sorrowful cadence of work songs drifting from the fields, a sound that was both the engine of this world and its constant, mournful dirge. This society was built upon a brutal and unshakable paradox, a culture that prided itself on honor, piety, and Gentile civilization, yet was entirely dependent on the institution of chattel slavery, the ownership of human beings as property. This was not merely a legal or economic system. It was a psychological framework. a perverse logic that permeated every facet of life and justified the subjugation of one race for the prosperity of another. Within this framework, a person could be bought, sold, mortgaged, and bred with the same dispassionate calculus as livestock. It was this chilling, accepted reality, this moral vacuum, cloaked in the perfume of magnolia blossoms and southern grace, that created the conditions for an evil far more calculated and intimate than whips and chains alone. It created the space for a mind to contemplate the unthinkable and call it innovation. At the cold, calculating heart of this decaying world stood Katherine Thornnehill. Widowed at the age of 28 in 1847, she was not the typical plantation mistress. Content with managing household affairs, the daughter of a wealthy Augusta merchant, she had been raised with an appreciation for ledgers and profit margins. She was sharp, literate, and possessed a pragmatic mind more inclined to commerce and science than to needlepoint and social calls. When her much older husband, a man known more for his genteel manners than his financial acumen, died, he left her with two burdens, a 16-year-old stepson named Richard, and an estate teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, bleeding money with every failed crop. To the outside world, she presented a portrait of resilience and piety, a grieving widow determined to uphold her family's name. But behind the closed doors of the Thornhill Library, a different Katherine emerged, by the flickering light of an oil lamp, surrounded by her late husband's debts. A cold panic began to take root in her heart, the terror of social ruin, of being cast out from the planter class and returning in shame to her merchant roots, was a fate she considered worse than death. It was in this crucible of fear that her pragmatism began to warp. She would spend her nights poring not over poetry, but over agricultural journals and new, controversial treatises on animal husbandry and selective breeding. The lines of worry on her brow were slowly replaced by a look of intense, unnerving concentration, the look of an engineer solving a complex and terrible equation. Her stepson, Richard, was the first to notice the change. He was a quiet, observant boy, caught between loyalty to his late father's memory and a growing unease with the woman who now controlled his inheritance. He watched as his stepmother's grief seemed not to soften her, but to harden her, forging her into something sharp and unfamiliar. He saw the way she began to study the enslaved people of Thornhill, not as individuals with names and families, but as a collection of assets, a living inventory of traits. He'd find her making strange, coded notes in her ledgers, her gaze lingering on the strongest men and most fertile women with a cold, dispassionate scrutiny he had previously only seen her apply to prize bulls and brood mares. A profound and nameless dread began to settle in his heart. The woman who ran Thornhill was no longer just his stepmother. She was becoming something else, something utterly alien. Guided by a purpose he could not yet comprehend, but instinctively knew was unholy. The first whispers of the nightmare had begun. The first whispers of the nightmare soon grew into a structured, silent decree that echoed through the slave quarters with the force of a death knell. The change did not come with a crack of the whip or a public proclamation, but with a quiet, chilling finality that began in Katherine Thornhill's library one evening, after scrutinizing the final, dismal accounting of the year's cotton yield. She pushed the old ledgers aside. From a locked drawer, she produced a new, pristine volume, its leather cover unmarked, its pages empty, with the precise, steady hand of a scientist beginning a groundbreaking experiment. She dipped her pen in ink and wrote the first entry. She did not write a finance or crop rotation. Instead, she began a new, horrific form of accounting. The heading was not Thornhill Accounts, but Thornhill Legacy, a study in hereditary husbandry. Beneath it, she drew columns. The first was labeled Rootstock, and under it, She listed the names of the 5 strongest, healthiest enslaved men on the plantation. Beside each name, she made meticulous notes on their physical attributes: height, strength, temperament, and perceived immunities to disease. The second column was labeled vessels, under which she wrote the names of the 10 most fertile women. The childbearing histories recorded with cold, numerical attachment. The final, most ominous column was simply titled Projected Yields. This ledger was her Bible, her blueprint for salvation. The vague, academic theories she had studied had now crystallized into a concrete, operational plan. Thornhill would no longer produce cotton. It would produce people. The first tangible step of this plan sent a ripple of confusion and fear through the enslaved community. A man named Isaac, a field hand known for his immense strength and quiet dignity, was abruptly relieved of his duties in the cotton fields. He was summoned to the main house, where Katherine informed him that he would now be assigned to special duties, a vague term that hung in the air with unspoken menace. That evening, he was ordered to the cabin of a young woman named Ruth, whom he barely knew. The command was simple, absolute, and stripped of all humanity. They were to couple. There was no pretense of affection, no illusion of choice. It was a transaction, a planting, orchestrated by a mistress who now saw them not as human beings with hearts and relationships, but as genetic material to be combined for a desired outcome. The silent, pervasive terror of this new regime began to poison the very atmosphere of the plantation. Families were fractured. Husbands were forced to watch as their wives were led away to the cabins of other men. Women who had found love and partnership in the face of unimaginable hardship were reduced to mere instruments of Katherine's will. The air in the slave quarters, once filled with the weary solace of shared community, became thick with suspicion, grief, and a helpless, simmering rage. Richard saw it all. He saw the haunted look in Isaac's eyes the morning after he was first sent to Ruth's cabin. He heard the muffled sobbing from the cabin of Thomas, whose wife, Sarah, had been selected as a vessel. He tried to question his stepmother, cloaking his horror in feigned curiosity. "Why has Isaac's work changed? We need him in the fields." Katherine's reply was chillingly dismissive. "I am reallocating my assets for maximum efficiency. Richard, you should be learning from this. This is how one secures a legacy." Each calculated, evasive answer only deepened the chasm of dread that was opening in the boy's soul. He was beginning to understand that the monster he feared was not some external threat, but the very person who now slept under the same roof. As months bled into a year, Katherine's grand experiment began to bear its tragic fruit. The unnatural order she had imposed on Thornhill became a grim, established routine. Pregnancies, once a source of communal hope and continuity, were now met with a fearful silence. They were not celebrated, they were recorded. Katherine's ledger grew thick with notations, tracking each planting with the same dispassionate detail she had once reserved for her crops. It was during this time that another key figure was drawn into the heart of the conspiracy: Miriam Grayson, the local midwife, a grim, taciturn woman who had delivered nearly every child, black and white, in the county. Miriam became Katherine's silent accomplice. She was paid handsomely in gold coin to attend to the births at Thornhill, and more importantly, to ensure that any undesirable outcomes infants born with perceived defects or those who did not fit Katherine's specific genetic vision simply disappeared. No records were kept. No questions were asked. Miriam's silence was absolute. Her complicity a shield that allowed Katherine's atrocities to remain hidden from the outside world. The psychological toll on the enslaved people was immeasurable. Men like Thomas were forced into a state of living death, compelled to father children with women they did not love. while his own wife, Sarah, was forced to carry the child of another man. The very concept of family, the last sanctuary in a world of bondage, was systematically dismantled. There was no escape, no appeal. Their bodies were not their own. Their children were not their own. They were all merely cogs in Katherine Thornnehill's horrifying machine. For Richard, living within the walls of the main house was its own form of torture. He was an unwilling spectator to a slow-motion atrocity, his powerlessness a constant, burning shame. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place one sweltering afternoon when he found the courage to sneak into the library while Katherine was away overseeing the fields. His hands shaking. He found the new ledger hidden beneath a false bottom in her desk drawer. He opened it. The words rootstock, vessels, and projected yields stared back at him from the page. He ran his finger down the list of names, recognizing each one. He saw the dates of the forced pairings, followed 9 months later by notations like successful seedling, male or yield terminated, weak specimen. It was all there, laid out in his stepmother's elegant, precise script. The full, monstrous scope of a plan crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. This was not madness. It was something far worse. It was a calculated, scientific, and profoundly evil system of human farming. The knowledge was a poison. He felt a desperate urge to flee, to ride to the sheriff in Augusta and expose the entire nightmare. But what would he say? Who would believe that the pious, respected widow Thornhill was a monster? They would call him a liar, a hysterical boy trying to steal his inheritance. The pressure of the secret began to suffocate him, isolating him completely. Thornhill was no longer his home. It had become his prison. The breaking point arrived on a cold, rain-lashed night 1.5 years after the experiment began, fueled by a desperate combination of conscience and rage. Richard could no longer bear the silent complicity. He took the ledger, the damning proof, and strode into the library, where Katherine was reviewing her accounts. The room was quiet. The only sounds the drumming of the rain against the window panes and the scratching of her pen. He threw the book onto the desk. The sound made her jump, a splash of ink marring her perfect script. "What is this?" Richard's voice was a raw, trembling accusation. "What have you done?" He expected denial, anger, perhaps even a feigned ignorance. He did not expect the calm, cold smile that spread across Katherine's face. She looked down at the open ledger, then back up at him, her pale green eyes glinting in the lamplight. There was no shame in them, no guilt. There was only the pride of an architect displaying her masterpiece. "What I have done, Richard," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone, "is save us. I have saved this family. I have secured your inheritance." She stood and walked to the window, looking out into the stormy darkness. This land was dying. Our way of life was dying. Cotton is a fickle king, but blood is eternal. I am not merely a planter, Richard. I am a founder. I am creating a new kind of legacy, a workforce bound to this soil not by chains, but by birthright. They can never be truly free, because they will always belong to Thornhill, just as we do. The mask of the grieving widow, the respectable mistress, had not just fallen, she had torn it away herself, revealing the face of a zealot beneath. The sheer, unadulterated hubris of her confession stunned Richard into silence. He had come armed for a fight against a villain. He found himself facing a god in her own twisted creation story. He stammered, pointing at the book. "This is an abomination. It's a sin against God and man." Katherine turned from the window, her smile gone, replaced by a look of pitying condescension. God is a luxury the desperate cannot afford, and these are not men and women in the eyes of the law. They are property. I am simply improving my property. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a silken cord of menace tightening around him. And you will not speak of this to anyone. Think of your father's name. Think of the scandal. Would you destroy the Thornhill legacy to save those who are beneath you? You are a part of this now, whether you like it or not. In that moment, Richard understood his true position. The confrontation had not freed him. It had sealed his fate. He had entered the room as an accuser, and now he was a co-conspirator, bound by her threats and the very name he sought to protect. The fire in his eyes died, replaced by the dull embers of defeat. He was no longer the master's son. He was a witness. And in Catherine's new world, witnesses were liabilities that would eventually need to be managed. In the aftermath of their confrontation, a new, more insidious silence fell over Thornhill. The illusion of a family, however strained, had been shattered, replaced by the cold reality of a jailer and her prisoner, each bound to the other by a secret that festered in the oppressive Georgia air. Richard was no longer just a witness. In Katherine Thornhill's cold calculus, he had become a fundamental flaw in her design, a variable that had to be controlled and, ultimately, eliminated. A woman who had built her entire new world on the principles of absolute control could not abide a variable as unpredictable as a conscience. Her campaign to silence her stepson was not born of rage, but of the same chilling pragmatism that had birthed her entire project. It began with a gesture that, to any outsider, would have seemed like maternal concern. A new tonic, prescribed by a distant doctor Katherine claimed to have consulted in Augusta for his nervous affliction, was to be taken with his evening meal. She would administer it herself. Her movements calm and deliberate, her expression a mask of gentle solicitude. The liquid had a cloying, herbal sweetness that coated the tongue, a taste that was both medicinal and vaguely floral. For the melancholy that has so clearly taken hold of you, she would say, her voice smooth as silk. To calm your troubled spirit, within weeks, a slow creeping lethargy began its assault on Richard's body and mind. The fire of his indignation, which had once burned so brightly, dwindled to a dull, persistent ember. His limbs felt heavy, as if weighted with lead. His thoughts, once sharp and racing with righteous fury, became clouded and slow, drifting like smoke in a windless room. He would spend his days in a fog of exhaustion. The terrible secret he carried now a distant, throbbing ache in the back of his mind rather than a sharp, motivating rage. Sleep offered no respite, only a descent into murky, suffocating dreams from which he would awaken feeling even more drained than before. He knew, in moments of terrifying clarity that would pierce through the haze like shards of glass, that he was being poisoned. The cloying sweetness of the tonic became sinister, and he recognized the underlying bitter note of oleander, a plant whose beautiful pink and white flowers belied the deadly poison. Within its leaves, a plant Katherine had recently begun cultivating with an almost scientific interest in a private garden. But the knowledge was a form of torture in itself. It was useless. He was too weak to flee, too isolated to cry for help. The enslaved people, trapped in their own silent horror, would avert their eyes, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew what was happening, but they were as powerless as he was. His slow, managed decline became the final, cruel proof of his stepmother's absolute power. He was a living testament to her ability to methodically and patiently erase any element that threatened her grand design. While Richard's life force was being methodically drained away, Catherine was simultaneously cementing her legacy in a far more tangible, permanent form. In the west wing of the house, a little used parlor with blackout curtains was transformed. She called it her heritage room, a name that dripped with a dark, layered irony. This was not a room for sentimental keepsakes of the past. It was a laboratory for the future she was engineering. It became her sanctum sanctorum, the only place where the full, terrifying scope of her vision was made manifest. Here, the ledgers filled with the coded genealogies were laid out on a central table like sacred texts, but they were only the beginning. She dedicated herself to its creation with the fervor of an artist. She ordered phrenological charts from Boston, diagrams that purported to map human character onto the bumps and slopes of the skull, a popular pseudoscience of the era that she had embraced as a divine tool to justify her theories of racial and hereditary superiority. She mounted them on the walls herself, studying them for hours. Beside them were meticulous, hand-drawn diagrams of human anatomy, with certain bloodlines and physical traits highlighted in red ink. The centerpiece of the room, however, was a large glass-fronted cabinet she had commissioned from a carpenter in Augusta. Inside, arranged on shelves of dark, polished mahogany, were dozens of small, labeled boxes. Each box contained a lock of hair, carefully tied with a ribbon. There was a lock from each rootstock male, a lock from each vessel female, and, most chillingly, a lock from every single seedling born of her program. Beneath each lock was a label, written in Catherine's elegant hand, noting the child's date of birth, their parentage, and a list of desirable traits they exhibited: strong constitution, docile temperament, high pain tolerance. It was a eugenicist's library, a catalogue of human beings reduced to their component parts. The heritage room was the ultimate, irrefutable evidence of her crimes, a meticulously documented, physically realized testament to a systematic and long-term conspiracy against nature itself. The end for Richard came not with a bang, but with a final, quiet whimper in the dead of winter. His passing was officially recorded as a result of a wasting fever, a story corroborated by the gold-paid silence of Miriam Grayson and the feigned, theatrical grief of his stepmother, who wore black for a full year. With his death, Catherine's last human connection to the old world, her last nagging shred of accountability, was severed. She was now truly alone with her creation, the unchallenged god of her own isolated Eden, and with this final, terrible freedom, her meticulous record-keeping evolved. The journals she kept in the years that followed were no longer just coded ledgers. They became a manifesto, a confession of unadulterated hubris written for an audience of no one but herself. Freed from the need for secrecy, her entries detailed not only what she had done, but the staggering ambition of what she still planned to do. The initial stock has proven robust, she wrote in an entry from 1855. The dominant physical markers, the ocular pigmentation and hair coloration, are breeding true in nearly 80% of the new yields. This is a success beyond my most optimistic projections, she described in chilling detail her plans for the second phase of the legacy. The first generation of children, now growing into adolescence, were not the final product. They were merely the foundation. Her ultimate goal, the masterpiece of her design, was to begin interbreeding them, brother with sister, cousin with cousin. She drew complex, multi-generational charts, mapping out pairings designed to purify the line and amplify the most desirable hereditary markers. She theorized that within 3 generations, she could create a perfect self-sustaining workforce, genetically engineered for servitude, and forever bound to Thornhill by an inescapable web of incestuous blood. This was the ultimate unveiling of her darkness. Her project was not just about economic survival. It had metastasized into a delusional quest for a twisted form of immortality. She saw herself as a pioneer, standing on the precipice of a new science that would revolutionize the very institution of slavery. The children in the cellar were the living embodiment of this confession. They were raised in a strange vacuum, educated in letters and numbers by Katherine herself in the dead of night, but completely isolated from the outside world. They knew nothing of life beyond the borders of Thornhill. Their only reality was the one their mistress had crafted for them, a world where she was the sole creator, the ultimate authority, the source of all life and purpose. Their chilling statement to the Union soldiers, "We are her blood," was not a plea for help. It was a simple statement of fact as they understood it. The day of judgment arrived in 1864, not with a clap of thunder, but with the tramping boots of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, when the soldiers, led by the reports of escaped slaves from neighboring plantations who spoke of a ghost estate where children never seemed to leave, finally breached the isolation of Thornhill. They brought the outside world crashing in. The discovery of the 23 children in the cellar was the catalyst, the spark that ignited the final, terrible revelation. When they brought Katherine Thornhill out of the main house to face the evidence of her crimes, the pale, identical faces of the children blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight, she did not weep or beg for mercy. Her reaction was one of pure, unadulterated indignation. "You don't understand," she said to the Union captain, her voice not pleading, but lecturing. "This is not a crime. This is progress. This is the future of agriculture. I have created a perfect model. They are my legacy." Her confession, blurted out in a torrent of scientific justification and aristocratic outrage, was more damning than any evidence found in her heritage room. She held up her journals, offering them as proof of her genius, not her guilt, in her mind. She was not a monster, but a visionary whose grand experiment had been crudely interrupted by the ignorant instruments of war. The legal and societal repercussions were swift and severe, yet strangely muted. Katherine was taken into military custody, her ultimate fate lost to the chaos of the war's end. There are no records of a trial, no official notice of an execution or imprisonment. Like her plantation, she simply vanishes from the historical record. But the impact on the immediate community of Burke County was profound. The soldiers, horrified by what they had found, did not keep the secret. The story of the breeding plantation spread like wildfire, a tale of Gothic horror that stained the reputation of the entire region. The shock and revulsion were universal. For a society that cloaked the brutality of slavery in the language of paternalism and Christian duty, Katherine's actions stripped away the veneer, revealing the institution's most depraved logical conclusion. The shame was so great, the horror so profound, that the community engaged in a collective act of erasure. Thornhill became the name that was never spoken. Its land was eventually parceled out and sold, its buildings left to rot and be reclaimed by the earth. The process of forgetting had begun, a desperate attempt to bury a truth that was too monstrous to confront. The arrival of justice had not brought closure. It had brought a silence that would last for a century. The arrival of justice at Thornhill was not a clean, surgical incision, but a brutal, chaotic tearing of the veil. With Katherine Thornhill taken into military custody, her chilling pronouncements of genius still echoing in the air, A void of power was left in her wake. Into that void rushed 17 years of suppressed rage, grief, and a profound, desperate need for purification. The first act of redefinition, the first true rewriting of Thornhill's legacy, did not come from the Union soldiers or any court of law. It came from the very people who had been the subjects of Catherine's horrific experiment, led by Isaac and Thomas, men who had been stripped of their fatherhood and humanity. The newly freed people of Thornhill did not seek plunder or random destruction. Their actions were focused, deliberate, and imbued with the solemnity of a sacred rite. They marched directly to the west wing of the house, to the heritage room. The Union soldiers, bewildered but sensing the historic weight of the moment, stood aside. The freed people shattered the locked door, a barrier that had once separated Catherine's monstrous vision from their lived reality. Inside, the room was just as she had left it, a cold, orderly testament to a madness, the air thick with the scent of old paper and chemical preservatives. For a long moment, they stood in stunned silence, a crowd of dark figures framed in the doorway, taking in the phrenological charts, the anatomical diagrams, and the chilling cabinet of hair samples. It was the physical manifestation of their torment, a room where their very beings, their strength, their fertility, their children had been deconstructed into a set of desirable traits on a ledger. It was a room that screamed the dehumanization from its very walls. Thomas, a man who had been forced to watch his wife carry another's child, a man whose spirit had been methodically crushed, was the first to move, with a guttural cry that was more anguish than anger, a sound that seemed to carry the pain of years. He tore a chart from the wall, the paper ripping with a sound like a scream. That single act broke the spell. What followed was not a riot, but a ritualistic dismantling. They did not simply destroy, they purged. The ledgers, filled with the cold arithmetic of their lives, were torn from their bindings, their pages thrown into a pile in the center of the room. The cabinet of hair was shattered, the small, labeled boxes trampled underfoot, mixing the locks of rootstock and vessel and seedling into an anonymous, meaningless tangle on the floor. Each act was a reclamation. Every torn page was a denial of Catherine's authorship over their lives. Every shattered piece of glass was a refusal to be categorized and displayed. When everything that could be torn or broken was piled high, Isaac brought a torch from the kitchen hearth. The flame caught quickly, feeding on the dry paper and brittle wood. As the fire grew, it cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls, a final grotesque puppet show of the pseudo-scientific diagrams before they, too, were consumed. The smell of burning paper, burning lacquer, and singeing hair filled the air of vile, acrid incense of liberation. They stood and watched, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, until the fire had consumed everything, until the room was a blackened, smoking maw. They had not just burned a room, they had immolated a philosophy. They had performed an exorcism, ensuring that the evidence of their dehumanization would never again be seen by human eyes. This was their justice. In the years that followed, the land itself seemed to conspire in this act of forgetting. Thornhill collapsed, without its mistress and the brutal, efficient system she had perfected. The plantation withered and died. The grand house, its west wing now a scarred, open wound exposed to the sky, was left to the elements. Rain and wind swept through the empty rooms, peeling the fine Parisian wallpaper and rotting the floorboards that had once echoed with Catherine's determined steps. The gardens, including the one where she cultivated her poisons, were overrun, their orderly rows consumed by a chaotic tangle of native weeds. The fields, once meticulously cultivated, were completely surrendered to the wild. Tenacious embrace of nature, the name Thornhill, once a whispered horror among the soldiers and a source of deep shame for the county, faded from local conversation. It became a ghost story told to frighten children. It's true, terrible history deliberately buried beneath the weight of communal denial. The land was eventually deemed abandoned and was sold off in parcels by the state during the Reconstruction era. Its identity erased, its soil slowly, year by year, cleansed by time. Catherine's grand eternal legacy, the one she had murdered for, had crumbled into ash and dust in less than a decade. The most profound and haunting legacy of Thornhill, however, was not the collapse of its buildings, but the deafening silence surrounding the fate of its children. What became of the 23, the historical record, which can be so meticulous about property lines and cotton prices, offers no answer. In the chaotic aftermath of the Civil War, the American South was a landscape of dislocation. Millions of newly freed people were on the move, a human tide surging across the broken country, searching for lost family members, seeking new lives in this vast, tumultuous sea of humanity. It would have been tragically easy for a small, isolated group of traumatized children who had no known relatives and no home to return to simply disappear. The Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency established to aid refugees and former slaves, kept extensive records, but a thorough search of their archives reveals no mention of a unique group of 23 auburn-haired children from Burke County. Did they stay together? A strange, insular family bound by their shared, bizarre history. It's a romantic notion, but unlikely. Were they separated and sent to different orphanages? Their shared story of being their mistress's blood dismissed as the fantasy of traumatized minds. This seems more probable. Did they, upon reaching adulthood, consciously change their names and scatter to the winds, moving north or west, desperate to escape the shadow of their origin? Their distinctive features are constant, unwelcome reminder of a past they fought to forget. One can only imagine the psychological burden they carried, the knowledge of their conception, the isolation of their upbringing. They were fluent in letters, yet illiterate in the ways of the world. Perhaps they chose to blend into the diverse fabric of African American life, their unique appearance a secret marker of a past they never, ever spoke of. This lack of an answer is, perhaps, the final, most chilling chapter of the story. They remain suspended in history, forever the pale-faced children in the darkness of the cellar, their voices echoing with a single terrible truth. We are her blood. Their legacy is not one of history, but of mystery, a haunting question mark that denies us the comfort of a complete story. Equally powerful was the legacy of silence adopted by the other survivors, the men and women who had endured the breeding program, who had been the rootstock and vessels, melted back into the landscape of the Reconstruction South, decades later, as historians and writers began the long, painful process of documenting the slave experience through personal narratives. A pattern emerged. While many former slaves were eager to share their stories of hardship, those who had been at Thornhill remained resolutely silent. In one documented case, a WPA-era historian attempting to interview an elderly woman named Sarah, formerly of Burke County, was met with a polite but firm refusal when the name Thornhill was mentioned. The woman, who had spoken at length about her life after the war, simply said, "Some things are for God to know, and for us to forget." This was not an act of forgetting. It was an act of profound agency. They refused to allow their identities to be forever defined by the horrors Katherine had inflicted upon them. By refusing to speak her name, by refusing to recount her crimes, they performed the final act of erasure. They denied her the one thing she craved above all else, a legacy. They took back the narrative of their own lives, and their silence was a testament to their resilience, a final, quiet victory over the woman who had tried to reduce them to a set of biological functions. This brings us to the final, unsettling questions that Thornhill leaves behind. What, truly, is a legacy? Is it the monuments we build, the names we carve in stone, the bloodlines we seek to perpetuate? Katherine Thornnehill dedicated her life, her intellect, and her soul to this very question. She sought to create an eternal legacy, one scientifically engineered to withstand the ravages of time and economics. She built her monument not of marble, but of human flesh and blood, and yet her true legacy is one of utter annihilation. Her name was erased from the record. Her land was repurposed and renamed. Her theories and journals were consumed by fire. The very children she created to be her living but breathing monuments vanished, taking her bloodline with them into historical oblivion. In the end, the survivors, the people she considered mere tools in her grand design, were the ones who ultimately wrote the final chapter of her story. And they did so with a single powerful word: silence. The story of Thornhill is a chilling reminder of a fundamental and dangerous truth about human nature, that the greatest atrocities are rarely the product of simple, mindless hate. They are, more often, the children of logic, of intellect, of a rational mind untethered from empathy. Catherine was not an uneducated brute. She was a woman of science and letters, a product of the Enlightenment's faith in reason. She used the tools of observation, data collection, and meticulous planning to construct a system of unimaginable cruelty, convincing herself that it was not just necessary, but progressive. She saw herself as a visionary, correcting nature's imperfections, applying the cold, hard logic of the farmyard to the complexities of human life. She is a terrifying testament to how the pursuit of a greater good, whether it be economic stability, ideological purity, or a twisted vision of legacy, can become a justification for the ultimate evil. Who, then, writes history? Is it the victors, the powerful, the ones who keep the records in neat, leather-bound volumes? Or is it the survivors, the ones who carry the truth in their bones and choose when, and if, to tell it? The secrets of Thornhill are a stark reminder that the official record is never the whole story. The truth often resides in the gaps, in the silences, in the names that have been deliberately erased from the page. And perhaps some secrets should remain buried. Perhaps the full story of those 23 children belongs only to them, a final piece of their identity that was never catalogued, never recorded, never stolen by their creator. We are left only with a profound and enduring warning that the line between civilization and barbarism, between reason and madness, is terrifyingly thin. And the past is never truly past. It slumbers, waiting in the silence, for those who are willing to listen.